If you've been keeping tabs on us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, then you'll know we're working on a 69-400 for the 65 GTO. So we really started to play with this thing. We're really starting to get into it and kind of get some numbers out of it. So the idea for us was to get some numbers on this thing and get it kind of popping and working. That didn't quite happen. We have two starters in the shop. Both of them went out. So I had to get another from AutoZone. Hopefully that can get this thing actually moving. It doesn't take much pressure to turn it over. So I think we should be good. Let's get this thing actually like halfway put back together. So if you guys want to see how to take the starter off and on a Pontiac V8, it'll be in the card above. Go ahead and click that and watch that real quick. Come right back here and we'll get to checking these numbers.
So first thing first, we ended up pulling the engine out of the 65 GTO. If you want to check out how we did that, check out the card above for that information. But really, we just kind of did that, pulled it out, got it on the stand. Once that was done, we could really take a look at the engine and see what we actually had. We noticed the starter wires were really burnt up, indicating a bad ground more than likely, and that it had touched a block with the positive wire. We assumed that was the issue with this engine, was just a screwed up starter setup. That didn't seem to be the case from what we found. The spark plugs all looked okay. All had light carbon deposits on them. They were wet because I sprayed fogging oil in there just to run that to make sure. As you can see, the spark plugs all pretty much all look the exact same. Light black carbon deposits, now covered in oil from fogging oil. So we're like, okay, fine. The engine seems at least halfway healthy, so we'll throw some degreaser on it, clean it up, figure out what we actually have, run a quick compression test, and when we did that, we had no start. The starter would not turn the flex plate. Beat on it, switched it out. You can see here, if you want to see how we switched that out, check out the card above for that. But that said, we did all these changes, and nothing really changed for us. Finally, we ended up throwing on the 326 starter. I got it to turn a few times. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get it on video. Did a compression test. Maximum I could really get was around 30 pounds, and even at that, it leaked out, and you could hear out the heads. So my first thought was that the valves were just staying open and pushing out the heads, because you could clearly hear the heads leaking every time you try to get compression in the engine. It was just super obvious what it was doing. But upon further inspection, all of the rocker arms looked good. But then we noticed that the rocker arms actually had a lash setting instead of a torque to yield setting. Pontiac usually uses 20 foot-pounds for this. They had it set to 0 lash-ish. It was not. As you see, most of these, they rocked really heavily, even the ones that were supposed to be tight. But with that said, we went through them anyway and just made sure they were actually good and opening and doing their thing. So next up, I did it by hand. My compression test by hand yielded about the same results. You see here we are getting movement out of the rockers as much as we should. A fairly small left hand we found out. It's actually a crane cam in this engine, so we're looking at like 0.45-ish lift. Nothing crazy, but you see the valves are moving quite a bit like the cam should. So as I was cranking it by hand, you could really feel the tension on the thing. It just did not want to move easily, and you could feel it where it wanted to stop and hitch every single time. So our thought was, okay, well, let's get the thing torn apart. Let's get the intake, let's get the distributor out, let's get everything just kind of ready to go so we can get into the valley and check the cam. Because Pontiacs are known for push rod and cam issues because of just improper alignment and improper setup. So we pull everything out. Man, it goes so much faster with two guys, I tell you what. But we just started pulling this engine apart. We really noticed little things here and there that were just not right. Mismatching bolts, studs where bolts are supposed to be, wrong heads, wrong threads, just a bunch of weird, quirky issues that we found in this engine, which is really not surprising because the 65 GTO that we're working on, that this came out of, had signs in the floor, it had AC ducting for braces, it had just general issues, metal-wise, you name it, it's got it. That said, this thing really pulled apart fairly easily, like it had been apart in probably the late 80s is our estimate. You know, and that is basically by us guessing from the age of the cam, because the cam is no longer available. It's a 288 2H, I do believe is what it was. So it's, like I said, a fairly small lift cam, fairly low duration cam, something like a 2801 basically, for about double the price. As you can see, the beautiful thing with the Pontiacs is you really don't need to take the distributor out to take the intake off. But if you look at how nice and clean the cylinder head area actually is, and how nice it all looks, we're pretty sure that it would have compression. It's just a matter of the heads being just gone. That said, while it's torn apart as it is, we know the engine was beat on because of what we found inside of the engine. Somebody that builds a car like that, an engine like that, is not going to take care of their car like we would. So at this point, you might as well just do a whole rebuild, right? If we pull this off, you see how they painted the inside of the valley pane, the inside of the valley. The problem with that is we found a ton of paint inside the cylinders, which also showed us, like, hey, dude, this car has been beat on. There's a lot of metallic in there. It's like, oh, man. What is actually falling apart? We thought it was going to be piston rings. Upon further inspection, we found more things going wrong in the engine than we really expected to. You see the lifters really just did not want to fall out. And that really indicates that either the bores are worn, out of round, so there's a general issue with it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. They're not going to fall, they're not going to get damaged really, but it's just not optimum for what we're after in building our engine. We want the least amount of resistance possible to make sure we're maximizing our effort put out by the engine. With the listers dispersed into the oil pan in my hand, we went on to the flex plate. So the other thought was maybe the flex plate was just bent. That didn't really seem to be the case. Once we got it off, it seemed totally fine. Nothing out of whack. But, you know, you're checking everything, so you might as well just verify, right? No point or no reason to not verify things. So we'll probably use this on a later build, more than likely. We got to looking at it, and the engine cleaned up fairly nice. We degreased the engine in another video, and it came out okay. That said, there's a few things we need to do on it still, just to make it nicer, and to recover a few parts. When you turn down an engine like this, you want to look for a few things. Things like the oil filter housing, the pulleys, and just a few other front-end accessory type things that are really hard to come by in the Pontiac world for OEM type things. Setting up your fans can be a giant pain in the butt, so getting all your accessories in one spot in one way makes life a heck of a lot easier. So here we are removing the water pump. The water pump is attached to the timing cover on the Pontiac, so that needs to come off before I can get to the cam. So here we're removing the harmonic balancer pulley. That went fairly quick and fairly easily. And finally we used a 15/16 socket on an impact to get the center nut off the crank. Pretty much standard thing, nothing crazy there. They're on at like 120 foot-pounds, so an impact definitely makes life a heck of a lot easier in that aspect. And I should mention here that you don't do like I do and drop 2 of the 3 pieces of the harmonic balancer that you get on the earlier Pontiac engines. Somewhere around mid-70 or early 70-ish, they switch to a 1-piece, and it's just significantly easier to work with. So like I mentioned earlier, the water pump is actually held on to the timing cover itself on the Pontiac. So you've got a bunch of bolts around the outside, and you've got about 4 or 5 that are also along the outside that hold it to the block itself and to the timing cover. These are pass-through bolts, so they're pretty important to get off. Otherwise, you're going to be struggling like I did when I forgot one of these stupid bolts for about half an hour. You know, if you're going to chase down this project, I would really suggest an electric ratchet or something like that, because it makes life just a heck of a lot easier. The good water pumps you're going to want are 11 bolts, so it can take you a long time to do it if you don't do it with an electric ratchet. You see here some of the mismatched bolts we're talking about. The one in front of the frame is actually the one that's not supposed to be there at all, and it had totally wrong thread pattern. So we pulled that off, pulled the timing cover off. Notice the fuel eccentric was actually rubbing against the timing cover, which tells us that something was set up completely wrong inside the engine. So once we got the cam basically where we could see it, we found a lot more issues. And I think that's the root of a lot of our issues that we had with the engine with the dragging. So if you look here, you can really see how much movement was in that cam. And that cam was punching that timing cover every time that it was rotating, basically, because the flat tappets, you know, they move quite a bit. So we pulled the timing set off, and it had a lot of play in it. We believe there's missing something on this thrust plate for the cam that allowed all that end play. So I know on every other one we've ever built, there's another little bit to that actually helps it hold in place. So the prevailing thought here right now is the improper use of a thrust plate or thrust button. As I pulled the cam out, you could really feel the difference in each cam bearing. And finally, if you check this out, you see the cam bearing on the back. Yeah, that's what was happening, and almost every bearing looks like this. So, this engine was no good to begin with and needed new cam bearings. If you guys like this kind of video, comment down below, let me know, because I'm really curious about that. I'm more than happy to make these kind of videos for you guys that are a little more technical, a little more highlighty of what we're doing. But again, if you like what you're seeing, please comment down below, let me know. Have a good one, and I will see you on the road.